Welcome to today's episode. Today, we'll be giving some time to a wonderful small biotech called Fulcrum Therapeutics. If you're like me, you're probably sick and tired of hearing about all the large pharmaceuticals. I'm talking about you, Lilly, AbbVie, and Johnson Johnson, who take up the entire swimming lane with all their news. That's why I created my channel, BioTech Swimmer, where we can highlight a different small biotech company each episode. That way, we can try to see who has what it takes to make a splash in the market. I am Bobby Swimmer, and I want you equipped with more knowledge on the technical and historical background before jumping into the water with any of these biotech companies. As the great Warren Buffett says, make sure you invest in things that you know. Here at BioTech Swimmer, each episode, you will leave knowing more at the finish line. Let's get started. Joining us today, as always, is our lovely assistant, Carly.
Great to be talking with you, Bobby Swimmer. Let's dive into today's episode. So, who is Fulcrum Therapeutics?
I am so excited to be talking with you about Fulcrum Therapeutics. Fulcrum Therapeutics is a clinical stage biotech. They focus on genetically defined rare diseases. Since they're in Cambridge, Massachusetts, they probably have a lot of Red Sox fans with their approximately 40 plus employees. Thank goodness they're not in Oakland, well, since Oakland's team's moving away. In any case, overall, Fulcrum is focused on their innovative technology. They want to find small molecules that modulate gene expression to treat the root causes of such disease. Okay, that was a lot of jargon, so let's doggy paddle a bit on this mission statement of theirs. When Fulcrum says small molecules, that basically means that their therapy compounds are small enough to be generally in oral form. That way, it's preferred by patients. Just think about it. Would you rather be taking an oral tablet? Would you rather inject it sub Q in your skin? Or do you want to go to some infusion lab and get IVs fished around in you? Yeah, it's oral compounds that most people pick. So they're focusing in on that. One of the things that is a drawback when you're trying to go oral small molecules is just it has to go through the stomach. So GI tract issues can sometimes be tricky in the design of it. As for the genetically defined rare diseases that they talk about, these are wonderful disorders for small companies to design for. That's because competition is generally much lighter. The National Organization for the Rare Disorders, NORD, lists about 7,000, and I do say that, 7,000 rare disorders. So there's plenty of rare disorders that go around for everyone to have fun with. As for rare, this usually means less than, say, 200,000 people battling this disorder. So, not a huge base of people. But again, it's ripe for the picking for these small companies. Fulcrum's initial IPO was way back July of 2019. Yep, it's pre COVID, if everyone always references the COVID era. So, they had a promising therapy at the time called losmapimod, and that's for facial scapular humeral muscular dystrophy, another mouthful disorder. But they have a super interesting startup history since they actually purchased this therapy from one of the big guys, GlaxoSmithKline. Of course, as everyone knows, it's usually the other way around. Usually, these mega pharmaceuticals are purchasing these small biotechs after the biotechs, of course, do all the hard work and show all the clinical trial data. So again, so cool that Fulcrum actually started up from buying Glasgow's yard sale discounted price compound. Regardless of this history, I'm sure Fulcrum's plan is still just like all these other guys, and they want to be purchased up by the large pharmaceutical once they show all their impressive lap times and clinical trials for the compound. More about their history in a moment.
What products are Fulcrum Therapeutics working on?
They have two main therapies they have focused on. They spent most of their time and money so far on losmapimod for the facial scapular humeral muscular dystrophy, which unfortunately they had to stop in September of 2024. It's a shame this didn't work, first of all, since Fulcrum spent a ton of money and time on it. However, more importantly, there were a lot of people with the disorder hoping it could make it to market since right now there's no other products on marketplace for that particular rare disorder. Fulcrum's current active trial with a lot of promising results, and of course, driving all the current investment interest, is a compound FTX 6058 for sickle cell disease and other hemoglobinopathies.
Bobby, before we talk about Fulcrum's active therapy, FTX 6058 for sickle cell, it is probably important to understand their first attempted product, losmapimod. Can you tell us more about it?
Absolutely. As I mentioned before, losmapimod was targeting treatment for the rare disorder of facioscapular humeral muscular dystrophy. This is a relentless progressive muscle disorder, really nasty disorder, that in terms it's number two of dystrophies, only behind the more well-known Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. Thank you so much for all the wonderful help that comedian Jerry Lewis did for raising awareness over all these decades for muscular dystrophies. I still remember seeing his telethons as a kid, which he was quite funny. Okay, back to FSMD. It's characterized by a condition where your muscles just don't regenerate and heal well. Over the course of your lifetime, it begins to cause significant muscle weakness of the muscles of your face, shoulder blades, legs. I wouldn't wish this disorder on anyone since our muscles are just so important for independence and doing all the sweet things we do for the people we care about the most in our lives, like hanging out and hang with our kids or taking a walk with our spouse on the beach. Okay, you can tell I like the beach. Anyway, losmapimod was originally designed by GlaxoSmithKline way back in 2006 and was extensively evaluated for inflammatory muscle injury, cardiovascular pathways. They were looking at a pathway called the selective P38 alpha beta MAP kinase, the MAP PK inhibitor. It was a pretty well extensively researched pathway, and they came out with this product then. So the cool thing was this medication was already well vetted since GlaxoSmithKline ran a full clinical three trials in over 3,500 patients. And again, that's 3,500 who had heart attack history. This was their Latitude TIM 60 trial. Yes, and I did just say they ran this in patients with heart attack history. Yes, the things that generally kill us, cardiovascular. So this is a pretty sick cohort of patients. There was good news and bad news on that trial. Good news was it was deemed relatively safe in this complicated patient set. Bad news, for Glaxo at least, it did not meet endpoint data of reducing reoccurring ischemic events and improving just overall heart function. So, because of this, Glaxo stopped the cardiac development of this medication in 2016. They continued to mess around with it a bit through 2015, 2018. It showed a little bit of promise with skeletal muscle remodeling. But since this product, they've already dumped a lot of money in, kept failing in these larger disease trials. Glaxo was absolutely ready to sell it off. And I was joking earlier, yes, they were ready to sell it off at a discount yard sale price. So the original founders of Fulcrum noticed some of these possible benefits to the skeletal muscle and also, of course, its safety data with Glaxo's large failed clinical 3 cardiac study. So in April of 2019, Fulcrum offered them a purchase price that they couldn't refuse. They gave them Series B preferred stock, the Glaxo, cash payments, and they also did the old royalty thing. Royalty deals always make me think of Kevin O'Leary, aka Mr. Wonderful, on Shark Tank. Fulcrum hit the ground running, and in July of 2022, they started a clinical 3 REACH study.
Wow, so they were already in clinical 3 trials only 3 years after purchasing the rights from GlaxoSmithKline. How were the results?
Yes, Carly, amazing speed with it, which shows how well organized Fulcrum's management team is. Their data and things were initially going very well with losmapimod. In May of 2024, Fulcrum signed a huge collaborative license with Sanofi. Sanofi got exclusive commercial rights outside the US, while Fulcrum still held on to their US rights for about 80 million. And there's a potential for up to 975 million in milestones, almost $1 billion deal. So, unfortunately, though, back in September of 2024, losmapimod failed to meet primary and secondary endpoints. So, Fulcrum did have to make that difficult decision to shut down the project and mothball the therapy. Their primary endpoints on the trial were absolute change from baseline in that reachable workspace. That's why they call it the REACH study, measuring the upper extremity motion. And their key secondary endpoints also were not met, which was the muscle fat infiltration, which happens when your skeletal muscles start to die off, and their patient global impression of the change, along with neuro quality of life upper extremities. So, again, unfortunately, they missed on the primary and secondary endpoints. But from this, there is certainly some good news from the failure. Remember the saying, what doesn't kill you does make you stronger. And believe me, Fulcrum is certainly not dead yet with their current product line of the FTX 6058. So, my take on this is that Fulcrum learned a lot with this initial agent, which should make them a more nimble and smarter company. And with their progressing along with their second lead candidate, the FTX 6058 for sickle cell. Of course, as a prior skeletal muscle researcher and knowing how few treatments there are for FSHD, maybe Fulcrum will revisit this compound in the future, maybe possibly trial it with a younger patient cohort that can be used more as a preventive rather than trying to correct a lifelong prior damage that's happened.
Okay, so Fulcrum's lead product, FTX 6058 Pociredir, is targeting sickle cell disease. Can you tell us more about sickle cell?
Sickle cell affects about 100,000 people in the United States. It's a genetic mutation in the gene that affects hemoglobin. This is the molecule that carries oxygen. Funny enough, hemoglobin fell too short of a six pack and can only hold four oxygens. To have sickle cell, you need to inherit two broken copies of the gene, one broken from your mom, one broken from your dad to have the full disease. If you only get one, you only have the trait and very mild symptoms. The red blood cell's main goal is to grab oxygen. That's what it does with the hemoglobin. No relation to Dodge's Hemi engine. And it transports it to all our key organs. In sickle cell, unfortunately, they lose their soft, lovable, squishy personality. If they lose that squishy personality, they can't get through those small little capillary tubes and they become sticky and stiff, like a hot piece of pizza cheese stuck to the roof of your mouth. This causes them to get stuck in those capillary beds, and when that happens, you don't get any oxygen to the tissue and you get a ton of pain. So people with sickle cell have a lot of chronic pain when these symptoms happen. Two interesting side effects. Normal red blood cells only live about 4 months before they're replaced. So if you take one of those $1 million baseball stars that start out in spring training and start the season. The 6 months later, they have a total fresh set of blood than when they started. However, sickle cell patients, their red blood cells only live 20 days, which I guess is about the time for the baseball playoff hopes to be dashed already for a team, say like the Oakland A's. Sorry, Oakland A's, too easy to pick on. Also, red blood cells have no DNA, and bloody crime scenes, forensic scientists are actually getting the DNA match not from the red blood cells, but actually from the white blood cells. The lack of DNA and nucleus help keep these red blood cells more flexible to get through those small capillaries.
Bobby, I guess with all that info on red blood sickle cells, it gives a new take for the Red Sox fans that work at Fulcrum Therapeutics. Okay, back to sickle cell. What are current treatments and why is Fulcrum going after this small niche with FTX 6058 Pociredir?
For the most part, current accessible treatments focus in on managing pain symptoms. They use an old school chemotherapy treatment called hydroxyurea. The good of hydroxyurea is that it's pretty darn cheap, with tablets less than $40 a month. It's been used for a few decades now, so we know what we're getting with it. It works by making more fetal hemoglobin, which has been well studied, and it's a well known mechanism that helps symptoms of sickle cell. It does this by improving fetal hemoglobin within the red blood cells that prevents the red blood cells from getting all stiff and sickling. The negative drawback is that it's just not effective on everybody, and it's based on the genetics. Also, being a chemotherapy, it lowers platelets, and which can increase bleeding and bruising, and it can lower the white blood cell counts, which can increase infections. So regular blood tests every few weeks, every few months are needed while you're using it. Now, in 2019, 2020, a new medication was FDA approved called Flexitor. It was originally made by a biotech called Global Blood Therapeutics, which of course is a perfect name, being Global Blood and Therapeutic. But Global Blood Therapeutics scored big and was purchased by Pfizer in 2022 for $5.4 billion dollars. Now, the drawback to Valexitor is that it was very expensive, about $4,000 per month. And although it has shown abilities to actually increase defective hemoglobin, which grabs oxygen, it did not show as much benefit to really the main symptom relief of these painful blockages. As a result, real life data just showed too much risk without the benefit. So Pfizer ended up stopping the sale of Alexitor back on September 2024. Now, in 2023, two groundbreaking gene editing stem cell therapies were FDA approved. The first was developed by CRISPR Technologies and Vertex Pharmaceuticals. The only big drawback, and it's a big one, is that the list price is about $2 million dollars. So it's called Casgevy. It's effective and it's a one time, one and done cure, which is nice, which it edits the defective hemoglobin gene using the CRISPR technology. Now, the drawback, of course, again, is the cost, but medically, there's also no free lunch. So to get this therapy in place, one of the reasons it's a little bit more expensive too is there's a lot of conditioning risk with it being a stem cell transplant process. So similarly, low platelet counts can happen, low immunity systems, so you can get these similar side effects of infection and bleeding risk. Now, the second sickle cell gene therapy was lymphedema made by Bluebird Bio. This they used actually a lentil virus vector for the gene therapy. They were a little bit more, and it's priced at $3 million. Now it's compared to CRISPR Vertex's $2 million price tag. So again, very expensive, which is prohibitive for people. Similar infection, bleed risk, conditioning.
Wow, so I'm starting to see that sickle cell has been a tricky disorder to treat. So if you don't have $2 million laying around, is there anything else other than hydroxyurea to treat sickle cell?
This is exactly why Fulcrum Therapeutics is so interested in this rare disorder. They're trying to come up with a therapy that is more accessible, effective, and hopefully safer. Now, in Fulcrum's recent Q3 2025 business update, to quote, extremely pleased with the compelling data from the 12 milligram dose cohort of the phase 1 Pioneer trial, which demonstrated that Pociredir FTX 6058 has the potential to meaningfully improve outcome for people living with sickle cell disease. Now, in that same release, they also noted this. So, to quote again, results demonstrated a dose dependent and clinically meaningful increase in fetal hemoglobin, HbF, evidence of pancellular induction of HbF, improvements in markers of hemolysis, and increases in total hemoglobin, and encouraging trends in vaso-occlusive crisis. They call it the VOC reductions. Pociredir continues to be generally well tolerated, no drug related severe adverse effects, SAEs, and no discontinuations due to treatment, emergent adverse effects through the completion of the 12 milligram dose cohort. Okay, so just to digest that, my take on this release is cautious optimism. Now, first of all, this is clinical one trial data. So just 16 patients, only 16. And remember, again, main purpose of clinical one is safety data. That's why there's only 16. You don't want to introduce this to a cohort of hundreds and find that it's damaging and killing people. So good news here though is that out of the 16, there was no serious adverse effects. So it's promising data. Now, clinical 2 data is the next step, and I'm sure they're going to be pushing that to the clinical 2, or at least requesting it through the FDA. And that's more geared to effectiveness. Now, in this clinical 1 data, though, they did show a modest increase in the hemoglobin count. They got a zero point 0.9 grams per deciliter, and they did show that it completely stopped the vaso-occlusion crisis, which is that painful kind of symptom that a lot of people have in about half the patients, 8 out of 16. Now, they showed in the mechanism in those 8 a pancellular is the tech term. And that just basically means that the red blood cells containing the fetal hemoglobin were more widespread than, say, just a few outliers. And that's a good thing.
Bobby Swimmer, it has been a pleasure talking with you today about Fulcrum Therapeutics. I'm looking forward to seeing how its lead candidate for sickle cell, FTX 6058 Pociredir, does over the next year with its clinical data. Who knows? If all goes well, one day they may get their own global blood therapeutics deal for $5.4 billion.
Thank you, Carly, for your assistance today, and thank you to all our viewers for joining us. Be sure to join us again for another episode of BioTech Swimmer, where we'll be diving into a new biotech company. Don't miss out on these informative discussions, so hit that subscribe button.